Eugene is in the national spotlight for the wrong reasons.
Homeless crisis, decay of great American cities.
This camp right here isn't the largest one. They say there are even larger camps along the Willamette River. Most people who are homeless are there because of extraneous circumstances.
Now, about 3,000 people are without shelter each month.
While the spotlight will be on Eugene for the next several days, the homeless issue will still be here long after the event is over.
Let's start with some facts. If someone had asked you up front which city has the highest number of homeless residents in the United States, which one would you choose? You might answer New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, each of these being vast cities with the kind of social issues that come to cities of such scale. You might equally have suggested San Francisco or one of the coastal California metros, which, while smaller in absolute size, are known to suffer from steep cost of living crises and housing unaffordability. Well, you'd be right, in a way. Los Angeles and New York do have the highest total numbers of unhoused people in the US. There are more than 70,000 in Los Angeles County and an eye-watering 80,000 in New York, according to recent counts. In some parts of LA, homelessness is so well established that places like Skid Row have been home to a stable population of unsheltered residents for the better part of a century. Other areas like Seattle's Jungle and, looking beyond the United States, Vancouver's East Hastings are also known for high levels of homelessness and social problems, something exacerbated by the fentanyl epidemic, hardships related to COVID, and the aforementioned cost of living crisis. Here's the rub. Los Angeles, New York, even Seattle and Vancouver are all either large or enormous cities. Eugene, Oregon is not. It is the second largest city in the state of Oregon, a distant second, having a little under 180,000 residents against Portland's 615,000 in 2025. Yet, according to the most recent Lane County point in time, an annual count of homeless for cities in the United States, some 3,500 people were recorded as experiencing homelessness on a single night in January 2025. That would amount to about 190 homeless people for every 10,000 of Eugene's residents. That's an extraordinary figure, and proportionally it's far higher than in larger metropolitan centers. So to put things in perspective, it's often Washington, D.C., which is incorrectly cited as having the highest homelessness rate among the big cities in the US. In 2025, the district reported more than 5,000 homeless individuals against a total population of roughly 700,000. Certainly a really big figure, and enough for Donald Trump to have the National Guard clear out 50 homeless encampments during his blitz of the Capitol in August. But that figure works out at only about 80 for every 10,000 people. On balance, less than half of that of Eugene. Even New York's vast population of around 80,000 homeless people amounts to only 90 per 10,000 in a city of that size. New York's proportional rate is higher than Washington, much higher than Los Angeles, and proportionally nowhere close to Eugene. But with that said, a quick qualifier. The homeless figures of 3,509 from the 2025 point in time related to Lane County, the administrative division of which Eugene is the capital, largest city, and home to half the population. Although it is reasonable to assume most of those reside in Eugene, it is also reasonable that some do not, which would bring down the real total figure. But even in the highly unlikely case that all of the homeless residents were divided up equally across the county, that would still work out at around 90 for every 10,000 residents. In other words, roughly the same figure still as New York City. And by the way, the homeless figure of 3,500 is about the same in Dallas, something determined by its own point in time for January 2025. But Dallas is home to more than 1 million people. Lane County, on the other hand, just 380,000. Now, it's generally assumed that the point-in-time surveys represent an undercount, which would be understandable given the difficulty of identifying every last individual living without a home in a given area. But an undercount of a few thousand more wouldn't impact New York's total figures in the way that a few hundred more would for Eugene. At that point, its homelessness statistics would just become bewildering. So, how did we get here? You see, while the scale of Eugene's homelessness problem stands on its own, this is a rather recent phenomenon. It was in the 21st century, for reasons that we'll get into in a bit, that Eugene's stats went truly stratospheric. However, what laid the path was a sequence of historic developments shared by Eugene with Portland and the state of Oregon in general, a state which currently has the overall fourth highest rate of homelessness per capita in the US, behind only the states of New York, Washington, and Hawaii. And some of those developments stem back all the way to the 1800s. At that time, Oregon's population surged massively. From 52,000 residents in 1860, the state morphed to nearly 200,000 residents only 20 years later, driven largely by farming, logging, expanded trade, and even the Southern Gold Rush. By 1900, the state's population ballooned to more than 400,000 people. It was a problem. Most of the new arrivals weren't very wealthy, with many working laboring jobs and other types of unskilled work. And so the state administration built a string of so-called single-room occupancy hotels, or SROs, to house them for cheap. The hotels offered Spartan single rooms for a low price with access to communal kitchens and washrooms. As time went on and the economy normalized, the SROs remained as permanent habitation for the city's poorest. And for a long time, this absolutely worked. But by the 1950s, urban renewal came into force. Higher-end living was in demand, and the state needed to clear room for businesses that could spur economic growth. So, the SROs went out the door, being demolished one after the other as the following 2 decades advanced. With that, cheap homes for Oregon's poorest went away too. Nationwide social service programs to help low-income families afford mortgages did remain in place, but in the 1970s, these two hit a wall. And all of that happened during the presidency of Richard Nixon. Nixon's 1973 moratorium on new federal housing programs basically took a hacksaw to the homes available to low-income families. Instead of providing funding for new, low-priced developments, the government changed tack and began to subsidize rentals in privately owned apartments, something which left tenants vulnerable to the turbulence of the economy. That economy just so happened to tank that very same year. War broke out in the Middle East, and the Association of Arab Petroleum Oil-Exporting Countries slapped an embargo on any countries that supported Israel, which, unsurprisingly, directly shook the US. Fuel shortages resulted, and a recession came quick. Poor families were now poorer, and even more dependent on federal housing projects that now no longer existed. Construction plummeted, and mortgage rates surged. Without speaking of lower-income households, those who would normally have been in a comfortable position to buy property were no longer able to do so, and some Americans at the very bottom of the ladder saw no other option than to head for the homeless shelters. But things got worse. In the 1980s, another economic downturn hit the United States. Some analysts describe this as a double-dip recession because after experiencing economic woes for 6 months, the US appeared to return to growth in July 1980. But it was a false dawn. The nationwide unemployment rate remained unchanged, and a fresh recession took hold in July 1981, which lasted for a full year before the economy recovered again. But by then, Oregon's manufacturing and construction industries had taken an enormous economic hit. Timber, once an industry that enticed migrants to settle in the state, had more or less flatlined. The Oregonian newspaper later described the 1980s as Oregon's Great Recession moment, a decade which changed the state forever, with thousands leaving and with previously middle-class communities being decimated. Homelessness shot up, affecting the principal cities of Portland and Eugene most directly. Oregon's industries eventually recovered too, but in many places, including Eugene, more problems were about to become very visible. You see, while the unholy trifecta of the removal of the SROs, Nixon's housing reforms, and successive recessions tore down access to the housing market and shot up homelessness rates, they weren't the only ill. They might have helped send people to the streets, but other factors would unite to help keep them there. Around the same time that the Oregon SROs began to be demolished in the 1950s and 60s, another type of institution was also put to the sword: the nation's psychiatric hospitals. What became known as deinstitutionalization sought to remove patients with mental illness from hospitals and place them instead into community-based care programs. Now, in some ways, this was done out of regard toward the patient's welfare. Psychiatric hospitals across the country had been subject to abuse of patients and conducting haphazard or poorly researched treatments. The lobotomy, for example, had endured for decades before being dismissed as pseudoscience. Deinstitutionalization also fell in with the cost-saving programs of Nixon and later Reagan, although the measure itself was actually introduced under President John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary, had undergone a prefrontal lobotomy in 1941 and spent the rest of her life cognitively disabled. As legal protections for institutionalized people grew and psychiatric medicine, like antipsychotics, were introduced, patients were cleared from institutional care. But that led to new problems. The Oregon State Hospital in Salem had a psychiatric ward which housed some 3,500 patients at its peak in the 1950s. It was a place of some renown, and it even served as both the basis and real-life set for Milos Forman's 1975 film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In the film, a rebellious but charismatic convict winds up in the ward, where he clashes with Nurse Ratched, an authoritarian who enforces strict and domineering control over her patients. In real life, deinstitutionalization struck the hospital around the same time the movie was produced, and by the late 20th century, most of its patients had cleared out to community centers across the state, such as Eugene's White Bird Clinic, which was established in 1969. But funding was inconsistent. The federal cuts of the Nixon and Reagan eras hit community programs hard, leaving local providers under-resourced. Many former patients, shunted back into society, suffered from mental illness which hindered their independence and which were too advanced for the community centers to provide necessary care. Added to that, the increased legal autonomy bestowed upon them, and many of the outpatients wound up nowhere near continued care and on the street. The phenomenon of individuals leaving mental health hospitals only to then end up in homeless shelters or in prison became so common that it gained its own name, transinstitutionalization, which is a mouthful. Salem, being roughly equidistant between Eugene and Portland, saw many of its former residents wind up in either of the two cities, and so the homeless population in Eugene continued to grow, nourished now by individuals who suffered from significant psychiatric illness in addition to those laboring from cold, hard destitution. Those unable to look after themselves unsurprisingly fared badly on the streets, leading to a rise in so-called chronic homelessness, that is, individuals continually homeless for at least 12 months or who'd experienced homelessness on at least 4 separate occasions, adding up to 12 months or more within 3 years. This was all bad enough, but by the 1990s, a new beast arrived on the scene, the heroin epidemic, as well as other substance abuse patterns. Many of the former psychiatric patients were especially vulnerable to the steep rise in heroin and methamphetamine use of the 80s and 90s. But this was still the Reagan era, when a statewide, zero-tolerance approach to drugs was manifesting strongly. Not only that, but many of Oregon's homeless shelters, such as the Eugene Mission, were faith-based, meaning they also carried a strict aversion to drug use on their premises. And so, drug-addicted homeless people were sometimes turned away, leading not only to ever greater numbers of unsheltered, but a greater prevalence of drug addiction among them. By the turn of the century, Lane County returned a census figure of 373 homeless, around 12 for every 10,000 total residents. But those figures only counted individuals residing in sheltered accommodation, not those on the streets. The true figures were likely much higher, and they were about to climb higher still. In 2010, local media site KVAL interviewed a young man living unsheltered in Eugene for a news segment. The man described having moved from Washington only a few months before and being qualified for several types of care work, including pedagogical and hospice care. Within a few weeks of arriving in Eugene, he had been forced out of his accommodation and wound up on the streets. Given his disheveled appearance, he described how landlords would not rent him, nobody would hire him, and how law enforcement would accuse him of loitering and shepherd him away from gentrified areas. He also pointed out that homeless shelters offered a place to remain overnight, which ended at 6 a.m. every morning. This would technically classify him as sheltered homeless, but leave his day-to-day existence tenuous and uncertain. In a curious dovetail with the past phenomenon of transinstitutionalization, he remarked, quote, "Homeless people feel more comfortable in jail because at least they have a bed to sleep in and they get food regularly." The man added that he would like to see more lower-income housing, something which by then had become a bit of a pipe dream in places like Eugene since the Nixon era. Granted, this was also 2010, shortly after the crest of the 2008 global financial crash, and still one of the worst economic recessions in history. Nationwide unemployment had peaked at 10% only a few months before, leaving the labor market at its lowest ebb since the 1980s. And if housing shortages were a problem in the period since Reagan and Nixon, then they were definitely a problem following the 2008 crash, when no less than 10 million Americans became underwater homeowners, meaning the value of their loans exceeded the value of their homes. Ironically for Eugene, house prices hadn't actually risen so dramatically yet in the early part of the 21st century. A local monitoring report found that the median price for single-family housing had risen from $138,000 in 2000 to around $180,000 in 2012, a 30% increase in 12 years. Nonetheless, the realities described by the man were very real and would not relent much in Eugene. in the years that followed. By 2019, the city was ranked by Security.org as having the worst per capita rate of homelessness in the entire United States. Local media began to document the encampments dotted across the city, and local businesses began to voice irritation with the tents and shelters which appeared by their storefronts. And all this was on the brink of the COVID-19 pandemic, after which time even worse economic prospects would force more people into destitution, adding to what was already an evolving crisis on the streets of the city. Amateur cameras documented the sharp contrast between affluent neighborhoods and the homeless encampments, often existing within eye view of one another. As the pandemic accelerated, the problems only got worse. In June 2020, Oregon introduced an eviction moratorium on rental housing, thereby protecting vulnerable tenants, and also placed a temporary stay on the clearing of homeless camps across the state. Eugene introduced a so-called Safe Sleep Cities measure, meaning homeless camps which would not be subjected to clearance for the duration of the emergency pandemic measures. But on the other hand, COVID-19 wreaked havoc on existing homeless shelters. Due to social distancing, their capacities were dramatically reduced and ever more people were turned away at the door. Visibly unsheltered homelessness therefore rose even further. And while the moratorium on rental evictions was extended beyond 2021, the pause on encampment sweeps was not. Local enforcement returned to clearing away homeless camps, and the unsheltered homeless tailspin continued once again. Those weren't the only measures which had been introduced at the height of the pandemic. In November 2020, Oregon voters passed Ballot Measure 110, an experimental law which decriminalized possession of small amounts of drugs in order to shift emphasis toward treatment. The measure also reclassified drug possession as a violation, equivalent to a traffic ticket and thereby punishable by a small fine or treatment referral, and redirected marijuana tax revenue to fund addiction recovery, treatment, and harm reduction services. But Measure 110 was a mess. Though it passed the citizens' vote with a 58% majority, it was opposed by many who argued that it would lead to a rise in street disorder, as well as drug recovery experts who predicted that it would raise dependence and overdose deaths. Implementation was chaotic, with the marijuana tax revenues not reaching treatment providers until 18 months after rollout. Many treatment programs were therefore chronically underfunded and unable to take on the volume of individuals referred to them, even though very few of those did so willingly. Out of thousands of treatment citations issued, only a small fraction of people called the hotline or entered support services. Fines often went unpaid without consequences, leading some critics to describe Measure 110 as all carrot, no stick. Perhaps above all, drug use skyrocketed. The measure coincided with a surge in the use of fentanyl, one of the deadliest synthetic drugs in history, leading to record overdose fatalities between 2022 and 2023. Oregon police, meanwhile, reported that they were powerless to confront drug use in open spaces and declared Measure 110 to be both ineffective and hazardous to public safety. Public frustration grew, and by 2023, polls showed most Oregonians believed Measure 110 had failed. In 2024, Oregon Governor Tina Kotek signed House Bill 4002, which rolled back the decriminalization of possession and effectively brought Measure 110 to an end. By the time Kotek signed away Measure 110, homelessness in Eugene had long passed beyond crisis point. A 2021 monitoring report found that while the median single-family home price in the city was $138,000 in 2000, rising to $180,000 in 2012, it had ballooned all the way up to $395,000 by 2021, including a 17.6% increase in the preceding year alone. Possibly given the proliferation of deadly drugs and the failed rollout of Measure 110, the death count among homeless had also risen. In 2023, the city had a vigil for 71 unsheltered homeless people who died in the streets of October of that year alone, a significant increase on the same figure from the previous year. In the very same month, another significant event took place. Sam Yergler and Nicholas Hollows, two former homeless residents of Eugene and advocates for homeless rights, brought a federal lawsuit against the city over the constitutionality of its park rules. They alleged that they'd suffered cyclical evictions and harassment by law enforcement, and that their attempts to bring light to the subject had been either met with deaf ears or silenced outright. The same Oregon Public Broadcasting release, which documented the lawsuit, also cited an estimated figure of more than 4,500 homeless in Lane County that year alone, a figure which contrasted widely not only with the 3,500 official figure from 18 months later, but even more so with the official figure for January of the very same year, which registered only 2,824 people. And if the official figure in late 2023 were true, it would leave the number of homeless people in the county at roughly 118 for every 10,000 residents. And again, This is without assuming that the majority of those are concentrated in the city of Eugene itself, which they probably are. The city's January 2024 point in time, conducted only 3 months later, again yielded a dubious figure: 3,000 total homeless. While recognizing a rise on the previous year, it begged the question, how could the figure published by the Oregon Public Broadcasting and the Point in Time survey have diverged so massively, especially given that only 3 months had elapsed between the two? And as you know by now, the official data leapt by a further 14% the following year, arriving at the rather unrealistic figure mentioned in the introduction, 3,509 in January 2025. Meanwhile, the number of residents of Eugene's emergency homeless shelters has also skyrocketed, as did the number of homeless veterans, which KVAL reported had grown from 151 in 2024 to 210 in 2025. Figures for unaccompanied youth grew too, from 198 to more than 230 in the same period. Perhaps there is a resolution in sight, but it wouldn't seem that way. Because by January 2025, the average house price in Eugene had broken new ground still. It was reported to have reached an astonishing $473,000, or a 200% total increase on the same value in 2000, even if adjusting for inflation. Thank you for watching.